My name's Oliver. I'm 29, and for as long as I can remember, my family has had a knack for making me feel like the smallest person in the room. It wasn't always loud, obvious insults, though there were plenty of those. Sometimes it was the way my parents would look past me when I spoke, or how they'd nod politely when I shared something I was proud of, only to immediately pivot the conversation to my older brother, Ryan, and his latest big accomplishment. To them, Ryan was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. Me? I was the dreamer who couldn't settle down, the one who never understood the value of hard work. Ironic, considering I've been financially independent since I was 19. For years, I bit my tongue. I thought if I just stayed patient, if I proved myself through actions instead of arguments, eventually they'd see me differently. But no matter what I did, my successes didn't seem to register. They knew I lived in New York, but in their minds, New York meant some dingy little apartment and a job that barely paid the bills. I never corrected them. I let them believe what they wanted, partly because I didn't feel the need to impress them, and partly because, well, I knew they wouldn't believe me anyway. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday evening. I had driven back to my hometown for the first time in months, hoping to spend a few days with my parents before heading to a conference. I had barely stepped inside before my dad's voice cut through the living room like a whip. "You're late." Again. I was about to explain that traffic had been brutal, but he waved his hand dismissively. Typical. No respect for anyone's time. Dinner that night was uncomfortable from the start. Ryan had big news. He'd just been promoted, and the entire conversation revolved around how driven and responsible he was. I smiled and congratulated him, but I could feel the subtle jabs my parents kept slipping in my direction. "Maybe you could learn a thing or two from your brother," my mom said at one point, sipping her wine. Dad chimed in. "Yeah, maybe you'd have a real career by now instead of whatever it is you do." It was the whatever it is you do that got me. I've built a thriving business from scratch, one that affords me a lifestyle I never even dreamed of growing up. But to them, because I wasn't chained to a desk in a corporate office or wearing a suit every day, it didn't count. By the time dessert came around, the air in the room was thick with tension. Ryan had just made a joke about me, probably crashing on friends' couches, when Dad set down his fork, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Oliver, you're 29 years old. It's embarrassing. You have no stability, no respect for us, and frankly, no future if you keep living like this." My mom didn't say anything, but she didn't defend me either. She just stared at her plate. Then Dad leaned back in his chair and delivered the line that burned itself into my memory. "Get your things and go sleep in your car. You're not staying here." For a moment, I thought he was joking, but when I glanced at Ryan, he wasn't laughing. He was smirking, like he'd just won something. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. "All right," I said quietly. No shouting, no arguing. I stood, walked to the guest room, and gathered the small bag I'd brought. As I stepped outside, the rain was still coming down, soaking through my jacket in seconds. I sat in my car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Part of me wanted to drive off and never look back. Another part of me, the part that had spent years swallowing my pride in this house, wanted them to know exactly who they were talking to. But not yet. This wasn't the moment. So I turned the ignition, pulled away from the curb, and headed back to the airport without saying goodbye. They thought I'd be curled up in the back seat of my car that night. In reality, I was flying back to Manhattan, back to my penthouse overlooking Central Park, the one they had no idea I owned. I didn't hear from them for 3 weeks. Then, one morning, there was a knock at my door. And when I opened it, my parents were standing there. In New York, looking desperate. And that's when things started to get interesting. I stood there for a second, my hand still on the door handle, trying to process what I was looking at. My parents, the same people who'd told me to go sleep in my car, now on my doorstep in the middle of New York City. My dad's tie was loose, his usual air of authority looking a little frayed around the edges. Mom clutched her handbag like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Neither of them said anything right away. Finally, my mom stepped forward, her voice soft, but with that practiced tone she used whenever she was about to ask for something. "Oliver, we need to talk." The last time I heard that phrase from her, it was about how I needed to start taking life more seriously, because Ryan had just bought his first condo, and I was still wandering. I stepped aside slowly, letting them in, but I didn't miss the way my dad's eyes darted around the entryway, scanning the polished marble floors, the artwork on the walls, the floor-to-ceiling windows framing the skyline. He tried to mask it, but I saw that flicker of surprise before his expression hardened again. "Nice place," he said, almost begrudgingly, like the words tasted bitter. They sat down on my couch, but the energy was all wrong. This wasn't a friendly visit, and it wasn't an apology. It was something else, something heavier. I stayed standing, leaning against the armchair, waiting for them to start. Mom took a deep breath. "We've run into a little situation," she began, her eyes darting to Dad. Dad jumped in, his tone sharper, more defensive. "Your brother's business hit a rough patch. The investors pulled out. He's in a bind. We all are." He said, "We," like it was some collective crisis we were all naturally responsible for, as if the years of them keeping me at arm's length didn't matter now. I didn't say anything yet, just let them keep talking. "It's temporary," Mom rushed to add. "We just need a little help to get through this. Ryan's worked so hard, Oliver. You know he's always been there for you." She stopped mid-sentence, realizing that wasn't exactly true. I almost laughed at that. Ryan had spent our whole lives undermining me, taking credit for things I'd done, whispering to our parents that I lacked discipline. The golden child image was one he had polished to perfection with their full support. Dad must have sensed my hesitation, because his tone shifted to that commanding voice I'd heard my entire childhood. "This isn't the time to be petty. Family comes first. Ryan's future is at stake, and as his brother, you have a responsibility to step up." That word, responsibility, hit me like a brick. They had never once framed their treatment of me as their responsibility. But now, suddenly, I owed them. I sat down across from them, feeling the weight of years of one-sided loyalty pressing down on me. "And what exactly are you asking for?" I said, keeping my tone even. They exchanged a glance, and then Mom said it. "We need a loan. Just enough to cover expenses until Ryan gets back on his feet." We were thinking maybe 50,000. I almost choked. 50,000, like it was pocket change I could just hand over without a second thought. And the way she said, "we," told me everything. This wasn't about them. This was about saving Ryan. Again. But then Dad added something that made my jaw clench. "You owe us that much after everything we've done for you." I sat back, studying them. I thought of every birthday they'd forgotten, every time they'd canceled plans with me because Ryan needed them, every moment I'd been made to feel like a guest in my own family. And now, here they were, expecting me to swoop in and save the day for the very person who'd made my life miserable. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about money. This was about control. They weren't here to ask. They were here to remind me that, in their eyes, I'd never really outgrown the role they'd assigned me. But what they didn't know was how much I'd outgrown it. I leaned forward, ready to ask a question that would change the direction of this conversation entirely. And just as I opened my mouth, Dad's phone buzzed on the coffee table before I could get the words out. He glanced at the screen, his face tightening. For a split second, he hesitated, and then he picked it up, stepping toward the window with his back to me. I wasn't trying to listen, but his voice carried in the quiet room. "Yeah, we're here now. Don't worry, he won't say no. He owes us." He paused, then chuckled. "Besides, once we get it, he won't see a dime of it back. I'll make sure of that." My stomach dropped. I looked at Mom, expecting her to at least look uncomfortable, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. She just sat there, smoothing her skirt, pretending she didn't hear. And that was almost worse, because it meant she was in on it too. Dad ended the call and turned back around like nothing had happened. "So, Oliver," he said, settling back on the couch. "We were thinking we could move quickly on this. No point in dragging it out." Something in me shifted in that moment. This wasn't just about saving Ryan's business or helping them out of some crisis. They'd planned this. They'd come here with the full intention of taking what they could from me and never giving it back. I wanted to call him out right then and there, but before I could speak, my mom leaned forward, her voice low and syrupy. "You know, we've always been there for you. Even when you made choices we didn't agree with. We stood by you. Now it's your turn." I couldn't help it. I laughed. A short, bitter laugh that made her flinch. "You stood by me? You threw me out in the rain 3 weeks ago and told me to sleep in my car." She froze, but Dad waved it off like I was exaggerating. "You were being dramatic. We just needed to push you to do better." That was when Ryan's name flashed on Dad's phone again, and without thinking, Dad answered on speaker this time. Ryan's voice came through loud and clear. So, did he agree? We need to lock in that payment before the bank closes. Make sure you don't let him think it's optional. He's too soft for his own good. I felt my hands tighten into fists. My own brother, the one they'd been asking me to help, sitting comfortably somewhere, assuming I'd just roll over like I always had. Dad glanced at me, realizing too late what had just happened. His mouth opened, maybe to explain, but there was nothing he could say that would make this feel like anything but what it was, a setup. A complete betrayal. It hit me all at once. They didn't come here because they saw me differently now, or because they wanted to mend our relationship. They came because, to them, I was nothing more than a means to an end. I sat back, forcing my voice to stay calm even though my heart was pounding. You know, I said slowly, it's funny. You've spent years making sure I knew I wasn't part of this family's inner circle. But now that you're in trouble, suddenly I'm the one you trust to fix it. Neither of them said a word. And in that silence, I made a decision, one they wouldn't see coming. But before I could lay the first brick of the plan forming in my mind, Dad tried one last move. Oliver, you're not going to make us regret coming to you, are you? I smiled faintly, already knowing the answer to that. And that's when I decided exactly how I was going to handle them. I didn't kick them out right then. As much as every nerve in my body was screaming to end the conversation, slam the door, and let them figure out their mess alone, I stayed calm. Too calm. It was the kind of quiet that made my dad shift uncomfortably and my mom keep glancing at me like she was trying to read my mind. I told them I needed time to think. Dad tried to press me. It's a time-sensitive matter, Oliver, but I just repeated the same sentence, steady and deliberate. I need time to think. They left after about 15 minutes, and as soon as the door clicked shut, I sank onto the couch and just sat there. For the first time in a long while, the walls of my penthouse felt cold. Not because I was lonely. I liked living alone, but because I realized how little these people actually cared for me. It wasn't a new thought, but hearing my dad's voice, hearing Ryan's smug tone on the phone, hearing my mom defend it in her silence, it carved the truth into stone. For the next few days, I couldn't focus on anything. I'd stare at my laptop and the numbers from my business accounts, the same accounts that proved just how far I'd come, and feel no satisfaction. Because what was the point of building a life you were proud of when your own family would twist it into a weakness to exploit? And then, as if to rub salt into the wound, the messages started. First it was my mom, sending long guilt-laced texts about family unity and how this is what your father would do for you, a laughable claim. Then it was Ryan, who didn't even bother to hide his arrogance. You've done well for yourself, Oliver. Now it's time to give back. Like I was some kind of trust fund kid living off their generosity. Every message was a reminder of just how low they thought of me, until they needed something. And the worst part? For a brief moment, I almost considered caving. Not because I wanted to help Ryan, but because part of me still, after everything, wanted my parents to see me as worthy. That thought was my lowest point. Sitting in my home office at 2 a.m., staring out at the lights of the city, I felt like I was right back in my childhood bedroom, waiting for a nod of approval that never came. But the longer I sat there, the more a different kind of clarity began to take shape. I thought about every slight, every joke at my expense, every time they made me feel like my achievements were meaningless. And then I thought about how confident they had been when they showed up at my door, confident that I would fold without question. By the time the sun started coming up, I wasn't feeling small anymore. I was feeling patient. Patient in a way they would never recognize until it was too late. I decided I wouldn't cut them off completely, not yet. That's what they'd expect me to do. Instead, I'd keep the conversation going, make them think I was leaning toward helping. Let them get comfortable. Let them think the hook was set. Because if I was going to walk away from this, I wasn't going to just walk. I was going to make sure they understood exactly why the door was closing. And when it closed, it would be for good. I picked up my phone and drafted a simple reply to my mom's latest message. I've been thinking. Let's talk again soon. And with that, the first quiet step of the plan was set in motion. The days that followed were oddly energizing. It was like a switch had flipped in my head. The same family that had always managed to keep me off balance no longer had the same power over me. Every interaction was now part of a chess game I was determined to win. While they were busy believing I was thinking it over, I was throwing myself into my business harder than ever. My company had been doing well for years, but now I started pushing into new markets, finalizing partnerships I'd been hesitating on, and greenlighting expansion plans that had been sitting on my desk for months. Deals that once felt like long shots began falling into place. Clients referred more clients. My network grew wider, my influence stronger. And with every success, I started feeling something I hadn't felt in years: complete control. Not just over my career, but over my narrative. I no longer needed their validation. I no longer even wanted it. My daily routine shifted. Mornings were spent in strategy meetings overlooking the city, afternoons were dedicated to site visits and signing contracts, and evenings were filled with industry events where I was no longer the quiet observer in the corner. I was the one people sought out. The contrast to how my parents saw me couldn't have been sharper. Every so often, I'd get another message from them or from Ryan. The tone always wavered between entitled and desperate. Have you made your decision yet? It's getting urgent, Oliver. If you care about this family, you'll do the right thing. I'd reply just enough to keep them hopeful, short, polite, noncommittal. Meanwhile, my financial position skyrocketed. A deal I closed in late spring meant an influx of capital that not only secured the company for years, but gave me personal leverage I'd never imagined having. I invested in property, not because I needed more, but because it was the perfect symbol of how far I'd come. A townhouse in Brooklyn, a beach property in the Hamptons. Each acquisition was a quiet reminder to myself: I built this. No one handed it to me. Even socially, things shifted. I reconnected with old friends who'd supported me back when I was scraping by. I brought them into my world, introduced them to the kind of dinners and events my family always imagined were out of my league. These were the people who'd actually believed in me, and watching their eyes light up as they saw the life I'd built was a far better feeling than any nod of approval from my parents could have given me. The most satisfying part was knowing they had no idea this growth was happening. In their minds, I was still thinking it over, possibly struggling with the decision, maybe even feeling guilty for making them wait. They had no clue that every passing day made their leverage weaker and mine stronger. By the time summer rolled around, I was at the peak of my professional and personal life. The business was thriving, my influence was expanding, and I was surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not what I could give them. And just when I thought they might finally back off, I got a message from Ryan that made me pause mid-meeting. It simply read, "We've decided to come by this weekend. We can talk in person." I stared at the screen for a long moment, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across my face. Because this time, I was ready for them. I didn't reply to Ryan's message right away. I let it sit there, unread in his mind, the little delivered icon taunting him. If they wanted to come to me, fine, but this time, they were walking straight into my territory, and I was going to make sure every second of it reminded them exactly where we stood. That week, I set things in motion quietly. First, I scheduled the meeting with a new PR firm I'd been considering for months. They specialized in high-profile brand image work, but what interested me most was their ability to document and publicize milestones. I wanted my professional wins, my philanthropic work, and my investments to be more visible, not just in the business world, but in the kind of social circles my parents had always admired from afar. If they were going to see me now, they were going to see all of it. Next, I called an old college friend, Mark, who now worked in private banking. Mark had been through plenty of rough times with me back when I was living paycheck to paycheck, and he understood why I was calling before I even explained. "So you're telling me," he said, half laughing, "you want the meeting to happen while you're signing the biggest deal of your career?" "Exactly," I told him. "I want them to walk in and see the ink drying." Mark didn't disappoint. By Friday, the paperwork was set, an acquisition deal worth more than they could imagine, one that would not only expand my company's reach, but put me in a position where my personal net worth would jump into a range that my parents used to talk about like it was reserved for people born into privilege. The night before they were supposed to arrive, I got an email from a mutual acquaintance, someone who still kept in touch with my parents despite knowing how they treated me. And it was a piece of information that made everything click into place. Ryan's business troubles were far worse than they'd admitted. Not only had he lost his investors, but he'd been using personal loans to keep things afloat, and one of those loans had been co-signed by my parents. If he defaulted, they would be on the hook for the full amount. Suddenly, their urgency made perfect sense. This wasn't just about helping Ryan. It was about saving themselves from financial disaster. And the number they had thrown at me before? 50,000. That wouldn't even make a dent. They'd need 5 times that just to stop the bleeding. I sat back in my chair after reading that email, the pieces falling neatly into place. This wasn't just an opportunity to refuse them. This was an opportunity to take control of the entire dynamic once and for all. When Saturday morning came, I had everything ready. Contracts on the table. A conference call scheduled with the acquisition team. My assistant. Yes, I now had one, prepared to walk in with updates at timed intervals. Even the setting was intentional. The panoramic view of Manhattan from my living room. Sunlight hitting the skyline just right. The kind of view you didn't just stumble into by accident. And as the elevator dinged and I heard their voices in the hall, I knew they were about to step into a completely different playing field. One where I finally held every card. The elevator doors slid open, and there they were, my dad in a suit that had clearly seen better days, my mom clutching her bag like it contained the last scraps of dignity she had left, and Ryan trailing behind, eyes flicking nervously around the hallway. I greeted them politely, stepping aside to let them in. Right on time, I said with a small smile, gesturing toward the living room. They stepped inside, and just like before, I saw the flicker of surprise in their faces, the high ceilings, the artwork, the view that made the whole city feel like it was spread out at my feet. But this time, they didn't hide it well. Ryan's eyes went wide for a moment before he caught himself, and Dad muttered something under his breath about not realizing it was this nice. Have a seat, I said, motioning to the sofa. On the table in front of them were neatly stacked folders, the kind you'd expect at a corporate boardroom, not a family meeting. My assistant, Claire, stepped into the room right on cue with 2 cups of coffee and a clipboard. Oliver, the legal team is ready whenever you are, she said, then gave a courteous nod to my family before leaving. Dad's eyebrows rose. Legal team. I shrugged lightly. Just business. Today's actually a big day for me. Finalizing an acquisition. I let the words hang in the air just long enough for them to absorb. Ryan forced a smile. That's good for you. But we wanted to talk about. Of course, I interrupted smoothly, leaning forward. Before we get into that, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about something. I opened one of the folders and slid a sheet across the table. They looked down at it, confused. It wasn't a loan agreement. It was a simple 1-page financial snapshot. My company's current valuation, my personal holdings, and recent investments. Nothing overly detailed, but enough to make it crystal clear that $50,000 was nothing to me. Dad leaned back, narrowing his eyes. So you can afford it. I can't, I said plainly. But I choose very carefully where my money goes. And after hearing the full situation, I let my eyes flick to Ryan. I realize your problem isn't just a temporary cash flow issue. It's structural. Throwing money at it would just be setting it on fire. Ryan's jaw tightened. We're not here for a lecture, Oliver. We're here for help. That's the thing, I said, my voice steady. Help doesn't always look like a check. I paused for a beat, then added, and I don't give money to people who lie to me. Dad stiffened. What's that supposed to mean? I reached into the folder again and pulled out a printed copy of the email I'd received, the one detailing the loans, the defaults, the cosigns. I slid it across the table. It means I know exactly why you're here. You didn't just come for Ryan. You came because if he sinks, you go down with him. The silence was sharp. My mom's face paled. Ryan's mouth opened and closed like he was searching for a defense, and Dad's eyes hardened. You've been keeping that from me, I continued. And yet you still expected me to bail you out without question. That's not family. That's exploitation. Ryan leaned forward, his voice rising. So what? You're just going to sit there and let your own brother lose everything. I didn't flinch. My brother made his choices. And so did my parents. I learned a long time ago that rescuing people from the consequences of their actions only guarantees they'll repeat them. Then I smiled. Not a warm smile, but the kind of smile you give when the game is already over. So here's what's going to happen. I'm not giving you money. I'm not co-signing anything. And I'm certainly not putting myself in the line of fire for a business that's already halfway sunk. You came here expecting me to roll over like I always did. But that version of me doesn't exist anymore. Dad's face flushed with anger. But before he could speak, Claire re-entered the room. Oliver, the conference call is ready. The acquisition team is on the line. I stood, straightened my jacket, and looked down at them. I have to take this. Feel free to see yourselves out. And with that, I walked into my office, leaving them sitting there in stunned silence, the skyline behind them, the city humming below, and the reality of their failures settling in. But as I closed the door, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. When I came out of my office an hour later, the living room was empty. No note. No goodbye. Just the faint smell of my dad's aftershave lingering in the air and the untouched cups of coffee sitting cold on the table. I thought maybe that would be it, that they'd lick their wounds in private and I'd never hear from them again. But 2 days later, my phone rang. It was my mom. I let it go to voicemail, and when I finally listened, her voice was tight, brittle. "Oliver, we lost the house." A long pause, then, "Your father says it's your fault." She hung up without saying anything else. The following week, I started hearing bits and pieces from people back home. Ryan's business had officially collapsed. Creditors were coming after every asset he had. My parents, tied to his loans, were forced to sell their home to cover part of the debt, but it still wasn't enough. They moved into a small rental on the edge of town, a far cry from the big house they'd always used as proof of their status. For years, they had treated me like I was the embarrassment of the family, the one they had to explain away at dinners and reunions. Now, they were the ones whispered about behind closed doors. And I didn't have to lift a finger. I just stepped out of the way and let reality do what it always does. Ryan tried reaching out once, a single angry email calling me heartless and accusing me of abandoning the family. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say. I had offered them something better than money, the chance to face their own truth, and they'd chosen to spit on it. Months passed. My life kept climbing. New contracts, new investments, new partnerships that opened doors I hadn't even considered before. Every so often, I'd look out from my penthouse balcony at the city stretching out before me and think about that night in the rain when they told me to go sleep in my car. I never sought revenge in the way they probably imagined. I didn't sabotage them, didn't make calls to ruin their chances. I simply refused to be used. And in doing so, I let their own decisions write the ending for them. The last time I saw them was at a mutual acquaintance's wedding. They avoided me entirely, sticking to the far side of the room. But as I was leaving, I caught my dad watching me from across the hall, his expression a mix of resentment and something else I'd never seen in his eyes before. It took me a moment to realize what it was. Respect. And I left that night knowing they'd never forget the day they came to my door, expecting the old Oliver, and met someone they couldn't control.